Ambassador, it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Jason, for the chance to talk to your viewers.
Ambassador, you've spent a lot of time in the Republican Party. You're the former governor of Virginia, where I was your constituent, but you were also the ambassador during the first Trump administration when you served at the OSCE. And you got to deal a lot with both the Trump administration, obviously, but also with the Russians. So you saw the ins and outs of how that whole relationship works. So I wanted to ask you about some of the things that have been happening for the past couple of days. As you know, there's been a lot of alarm. Just yesterday, we saw Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that the U.S. did not believe that it's realistic that Ukraine regain its 1991 borders, nor did it support Ukraine getting into NATO now. How should we interpret that? Does that mean that the U.S. has just reversed its policy for the past few years and no longer supports Ukraine as it had?
First of all, I don't understand why the Secretary of Defense has become the main policy spokesman for the United States in Europe right now. And second of all, because after all, Keith Kellogg has been that designated interlocutor, and he's not here in this discussion with Hegseth. Second of all, what Hegseth said is basically Putin's position. So I don't understand why, if you're trying to get into a real negotiation, you just start off by giving your adversary everything he asked for. Third of all, let me be clear that when I was the ambassador in Vienna several years ago, Ukraine wanted to be a part of NATO in order to deter any type of Russian invasion. They did not get to be a member of NATO, and there was no serious discussion of their being a part of NATO at that point. But that issue has reemerged because of the fascist Russian onslaught. That's put that back up on the table. But why the United States would simply say that that's not going to happen at this point, at the very beginning of the discussion, puzzles me. I'm not sure why that's going on.
So, likewise, I wanted to ask you, we saw that recently, just a couple days ago, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, spoke with the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin. And in that call, it seems that it was very warm and that they found a lot of common language. In fact, Trump said that Putin referred to common sense quite a bit, which he identified with. Now, when we look at this, what worries a lot of people who support Ukraine is that Ukraine was left out. As you know, the policy of the United States had earlier been that Ukraine would never be divided, it would never be left to the side of negotiations, but the Ukraine, of course, would be involved in any negotiations about its own future. How should we interpret this? Does this mean that Ukraine is not going to be part of the negotiations as to its own future? Or rather, it'll be a deal made by Putin and Trump?
Well, we don't know what's going to go forward, but that would seem to be the implication. I do believe that there was a briefing of Zelensky after that. What I think is going on here, and I'm speculating, but what I think is going on is that Trump believes that building good relations with an adversary allows for a better result in a negotiation. But the problem I see with that is that Putin is a very savvy person. He was a KGB agent when the Soviet Union was ruling over Central and Europe and influencing the balance of the world powers. So he wants to go back to that. And I don't believe that buddying up with him is going to work. I just don't think it works. But in the end, it's the outcome that we're trying to figure out. What is the proper outcome? In my view, the Ukraine emergence as an independent nation, which they were when I was and are when I was the ambassador, I negotiated and talked to the Ukrainians every week personally. They were a separate country. They sat in the OSCE conference every week as an independent country. They were actually very adversarial with the Russians in the conference. I was there, and my position on behalf of the Trump administration was to be supportive of Ukraine, which I was. Ukraine is an independent nation. Putin does not believe that. He believes that Ukraine is not an independent nation. And he wants to eliminate it as an independent nation. Now, it could become a province. I think he wants the same thing for Belarus. But the people of Belarus don't want to be a satrap of Russia, and neither do the people of Ukraine. So I think that the future is still ahead of us on this. We don't know what's going to happen. But my view is that We should be marshaling and saving as much of the Ukrainian military as possible while the Russians are bled, which has been a terrible bleeding of the Russian situation and a weakening of Russia. And I think that's the policy that we ought to be following until Zelensky and the Ukrainians decide to change course. It's their country, after all, Jason.
Absolutely the case. But recently, you've seen that Russia has been stepping up its language about taking back the Baltic states, even invading them. So, if that were to occur, do you think that the US would step up to help our Baltic allies or members of NATO? Or do you think that they should interpret what's going on now as a sign that the US is simply not interested anymore? The US will not come to defend its allies. The US will change its course when it's politically expedient to do so in the US.
Well, of course, I don't think that surrendering the Baltics or Ukraine, for that matter, is politically expedient. I think that it's not a good position for the United States' safety. But that being said, I was in Lithuania some months ago for a brief conference there, and I came away with in a very short visit with just one resolved situation, and that is that the Baltic states were determined to be free and determined not to go back under the tyranny of a new Russian empire. They were determined. We've seen since that time they're building up their military. We've seen that some of the Europeans are putting in battalions. So there's a message going to Moscow at this point that they will fight. It is not good enough to just say, well, they're going to lose because they may not lose. But their backs at this point are there with the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians and other NATO powers. So, but the direct answer to your question, these are all NATO countries. So if they're invaded either by little green men, which then follows with regular military and that kind of political device that would be used, well, we all have a treaty obligation under NATO to support them to the best way that we can. And that does mean a war. Once again, Jason, everything that I've been doing over the past 3 years is an effort to avoid a major conflict, not to have one. And so I think that the Balts need to be supported. I think they're going to stand up for themselves. They've made it quite clear. But the larger point for you, Jason, is the one I think that you know, which is that Putin's target at this point really isn't just Lithuania or Estonia or even Ukraine. The target at this point is a global reach by Russia and their way of doing things. That's the danger to the United States, that the 21st century will be dominated by Russia, Chinese way of doing things. And that's not in the American people's best interest. But the interim point is what prevents that situation? And the answer is right now in Europe, NATO. Putin's interim goal is the collapse of NATO. So if he goes into the Baltics and then we're not supportive of the Baltic states, that collapses NATO. And then at that point, it's game on, in my view.
So, as you know, Donald Trump is known to be very proud of the fact that he can always make a deal. In fact, he wrote The Art of the Deal. So, when we look at what's going on now, we've seen recently a lot of talk about extracting $500 billion worth of rare earth metals from Ukraine in order to help Ukraine pay for the weaponry that it wishes to get from the United States. Now, what's sort of interesting about that is that most of those metals would be located where the war currently is, near the front lines, or in the Russian occupied territories. Now, how would you interpret that? Does that mean that the US will be supportive of Ukraine liberating those territories? Because that would be the only way that the US would be able to get access to those metals.
Well, the deal that he's talking about doing right now is not with Russia, it's with Ukraine. It's with Zelensky and Zelensky's government in Ukraine. So the obvious interpretation is that we'll be supportive of Ukraine in the war, that we'll give them more of what they need, that they can push the Russians out of their country, and then this rare metals deal can be effectuated. That's the superficial conclusion, and I certainly hope for that because we need the metals, and Ukraine is prepared to make a deal in order to provide those metals to us, essential strategic metals, in return for their own safety and security and pushing the Russian invader out. So that's a conclusion. The worrisome thing is that with the Hegseth comments, that would seem to be a surrender of the front lines where they are, which would mean that deal is not possible. So I don't yet understand how that works. I don't understand how the rare metals deal compared to the Hegseth comments square. I'm not sure about that yet. And one of the things that you can say about Trump is he likes to keep people guessing. Well, he's got me guessing. So I think that he may have Putin guessing. But believe me, Putin has invested at this point enormous resources to achieve his political goals. He has cost himself maybe as many as 750,000 of his citizens dead and wounded to achieve his political goals. The negotiation we're talking about is a political negotiation. The question is, are you going to do a deal that serves our interests, or are we going to do a deal that serves Putin's interests? And I think that decision is still ahead of us.
So, Trump, as much as he talks about making deals, we've seen that sometimes those deals don't really come to fruition the way that we'd hoped. An example being the deal to withdraw from Afghanistan. When finally the US pulled out, it seems that it simply didn't coordinate well with local stakeholders. It did not coordinate with the host country, and Afghanistan collapsed. Now, it was under the Biden administration, but the deal was made during the Trump administration. Could that sort of a scenario play out this time? Could the US abandon Ukraine or make a deal with Russia that Russia doesn't abide by that leads to Ukraine's total collapse?
Well, of course. Look, my impression of the Afghan situation was a strategic decision was made by the Trump administration to stop investing in Afghanistan, that was something that they were determined to do. But the effectuation of that was by President Biden. And I believe that President Biden just kind of in a private meeting just said, "I'm going to prove that I'm the president and nobody else is. I'm the big deal and nobody else is. We're going to get out on this time and we don't care what the consequences are." That was bad presidential leadership at that time by President Biden. We have not yet paid the full cost of that withdrawal in that way. We could have, as Trump has said many times, we could have left soldiers in Bagram Air Force Base in a pretty secure way, which would have been a constant reminder to the Afghans that they needed to behave better and that the Taliban wasn't in charge of everything. That never happened under President Biden. So the Afghan problem is still there. Could that happen in Ukraine? Look, I said a few minutes ago, I think the wild card here is the Europeans. Just because the United States decides to do any particular thing in the going forward doesn't mean that that binds the rest of the European countries, and they have to look after their own interests. As I've said relentlessly over the past 3 years, I believe that Europe's safety and security is essential to the safety and security of the United States. I think World War II demonstrated that fact. But there are some Republicans that don't agree with that because they're just fatigued and they just think that war is not a good thing. Well, it isn't a good thing, and that the punishment of Ukraine is terrible. But at the end of the day, the decision about whether to have a war or not is in Putin's hands, nobody else's.
Surely the case. But one thing that's really concerned a lot of people is that Trump does have very strong pro Ukraine people in his cabinet or working with him. We've seen the case of Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State. Marco Rubio is always outspoken. His support for Ukraine has extremely strong grasp of international relations, and he was a real leader, actually, in the Senate, talking about the threat of Russian aggression. We see there's other people, like Ukraine Special Envoy Keith Kellogg. General Kellogg has been very outspoken in support of Ukraine. His own child actually works to support Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, and it seems in both cases, they've been pushed by the side. We don't see that President Trump is conferring with them often, or at least not publicly. Instead, recently, when Mark Fogel, a U.S. citizen who had been detained in Russia for several years, when his release was negotiated, it was a businessman, a billionaire who works in real estate in New York, who knew Trump for many years, who flew to Moscow in his private airplane to negotiate the release. How should we interpret this? Does this mean that the experts, the ones who really understand Russia or really understand Ukraine and really understand national security, are being pushed aside so that billionaire friends of Trump are the ones who make the decision to America's national security?
Well, we don't know what the future holds. Rubio is the Secretary of State. He is in charge of the diplomacy of the United States, but he can only act with presidential authority, just like Musk is doing what he's doing because he's borrowing presidential authority. The Secretary of State only has the authority and the policy that the president of the United States, elected by the people, gives him. Same for Kellogg, who I'm frankly a little surprised that it is not Kellogg making some of these statements as opposed to the Secretary of Defense. But it's early days yet. We don't know. But let me have a word about the hostage situation. The dictators across the world today are playing on the values of the West, particularly of the United States, and those values are that we value the people that they're taking hostage. Hamas understood that precisely when they took those hundreds of hostages. That was for leverage in negotiation and with Israel and the West generally. Now we have a situation where there are plenty of Americans at this point who have been taken hostage by Russia, and so that gives Putin some leverage. He can, at that point, give away one or two Americans. I want to say this. I'm not unmindful of the fact that the families are thrilled and happy that their loved ones are coming home, and I appreciate that humanitarian interest. But as a statesman, you have to recognize the game that's being played here. No American anywhere in the world is safe at this point if they're living in any of these authoritarian countries, because hostage diplomacy is now underway in Israel, in Russia, in Ukraine. It's underway. And so that is going to be an ongoing problem. Now, finally, I want to say something about the Fogel release. I congratulate the businessman Wyckoff who went over there and effectuated that. He appears to me to be a peer of the United States president. They're both about the same age. They have the same look. They're both rich men. They're both from New York. They're both real estate developers. So I'm not surprised that President Trump has confidence in his old friend. And by the way, that's not a bad way to do diplomacy. But it is true that I think at this point that the official channels of Kellogg and Rubio are not being used. So let's see how this plays out. Wyckoff, after all, is a Middle Eastern envoy, not a Russian envoy. So let's see how this plays out in the future. But it is true that the president has confidence in him, and I congratulate him on this humanitarian victory. But I understand the downside of the statecraft.
So that's true. It is great that Fogel is released. But I want to ask you a different question. You, as a lifelong Republican, and also somebody who I can vouch for, is very strongly pro-Ukraine and supports democratic values internationally. Why is it that some Republicans now are choosing not to negotiate with strength with Putin, but rather to make concessions before negotiations even begin? They are willing to just give away things. Putin undoubtedly interprets that as weakness. And right now, Putin is the one who's in the weak situation. As you observed, he's lost 750,000 men injured or killed in this war. 40% of the Russian budget now goes to the war. The Russian situation is one of weakness, one that the U.S. could take advantage of. But instead, we're just giving away things. Why have Republicans changed so much?
Well, you're asking me about Republicans. Let me start by saying that about my motivation, because you raised it. What is driving me is American interests. I support the Ukraine war because it is in America's interest to do so, to stop the fascist aggressor in Moscow. I'm really operating on behalf of the safety and security of the United States of America, which causes me to support the Ukraine war. So that's what's motivating me. Yes, I am a lifelong Republican. I became a conservative Republican when I was 17 years old. That was a long time ago. And I have been continuously involved in politics through my entire life. I am a conservative Republican, and that's what I'm going to continue to be. With respect to the current situation in the Republican Party, I think there are many views in the Republican Party right now. I don't think I'm seeing leadership right now in the traditional Reagan approach, which is my approach, but peace through strength is the correct approach. That's what Reagan's approach was. But I just don't see it being effectuated through statements like Pete Hegseth's. So let's see what happens. I think that the Republican Party is evolving, and it can continue to evolve and continue to be a spokesman on behalf of human freedom and liberty. Yeah, just one point of my observation. When I'm an ambassador and I'm talking about foreign policy, I'm trying to be nonpartisan. That's what I was as United States ambassador. Would have been wrong for me to be anything but nonpartisan as United States ambassador. But sometimes I take that hat off and I put on my partisan hat because I was a very partisan Republican governor. So the goal here is to figure out which hat you're wearing at any particular point in time. My view is that the Democratic Party has failed in its duty. It has not offered the American people any type of actual alternative. They have, over the past 4 years with President Biden, offered crazy, irrelevant, nutty policies, which I believe that the American people rejected when they elected Donald Trump. And I was for that. I supported Donald Trump to be president of the United States because the Democrats are so completely unacceptable. Now the question is, what role will the Republicans play? And that remains to be defined, I believe, by leadership in the Republican Party. But we still have a lot to see here. The president, of course, is the de facto leader of the Republican Party, is setting the tone right now, and that is evolving also, Jason. And we just have to watch the way that it develops.
Surely. So let me ask you one last question. You mentioned Reagan. The Republican Party certainly is changing. And I think that it's changed in ways that perhaps many of us would have never have guessed, such as Tulsi Gabbard now heading up U.S. national security. But let's go back to Reagan. How do you think Ronald Reagan would have handled the situation that we see today in Ukraine?
Well, I believe that what we saw with Ronald Reagan was he actually recognized the precarious position he was in when he inherited the presidency or he was elected to the presidency, and he built up American strength. He made it a priority to build up American strength. He walked away from a negotiation like the one that was in Iceland, or the Reykjavik discussions he was having with Gorbachev. He walked away from that negotiation because he didn't think it was in the American national interest, and instead built up American power. The result ultimately was the Russians in Moscow had to confront their situation, and they recognized their weakness. And the decision that Gorbachev made was in the best interest of the Russian people. And so then at that point, there was a happy opportunity for there to be a confluence of Western and Eastern goals. We don't know whether that happy situation can still occur. We don't know because Putin is obviously a very bloodthirsty dictator and has made up his mind that he wants to rebuild the Russian Empire to control Eastern Europe and influence Western Europe and therefore threaten the United States. That's his policy. I think we have a duty as Republicans to recognize that and to not let that happen in the interest of the American people.
Well, I certainly agree. Governor, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for your service.
Thank you for yours. I appreciate your viewership.